Right, this transfer shaft, I'll just check that there's no water or moisture in there from the cleaning process. A smear of grease on the inside, smear of grease on the outside, and a much smaller smear of grease on that front face. That should drop in over the transfer shaft and into the socket on the front standard. Here is our cover. Now we had 2 screws for that. Now I think I noted that one of the screws was a bit ugly looking and one of the screws was still quite pretty. So I'm making a point of using the ugly screw down here where it cannot be seen. And the prettier example at the top where it can be seen. Somebody had just slipped with their screwdriver when they were installing that and scarred the screw. I'm checking the action of the focus. It's nice and smooth. What I'm watching for here is if I've set this position, you can move this slightly inwards or outwards. If it's moved too far in, you'll find that this shield will catch this focus scale and it can scratch it or just give you some friction so that it doesn't run as smoothly as it should do. Now I'm fitting in our coupling ring here. This couples to the rangefinder. And this is fixed to the inner helical with 2 small screws. The screws look much like the 4 used to retain the focus scale ring, except they are smaller. Smaller in diameter, both in the head and in the threaded section. Get those 2 in and snug them up. We have 1 screw at the top. This is the post that couples to the rangefinder, and again I'm just making sure that's lined up with the arm. That screws into that arm on that bracket we've just put in, and it drops into a slot. If you haven't got it seated correctly, it won't drop into the slot. I'm checking the action. Now I'll zoom in a bit. You'll see that as I move the focus scale here, at the top here you'll see that stud move in and out. That's good. I'll put a little bit of grease on at this point so that stud will move smoothly down the track. When you fold the front of the camera, that arm is hinged and that stud travels on a track back out of the way. That allows you to close the front of the camera. If it went in a straight line, it would have to poke out the back of the camera. That action's good. The focus is nice and smooth. We know we've put everything back where it came from, so our focus should be bang on, and that part's done. Now, because I'm so interested in making sure that my shutter release shaft doesn't fall out and cause me grief, I'm going to reassemble the rewind shortly so that I've got somewhere to hook a rubber band around this to keep the shutter release in place. So, our rewind. Now you might recall that I was concerned about the marks on this piece here, the corrosion. And I'm looking down the shaft there to see what that looks like. I'm going to try a little bit of grease on there and see how well that runs. If it's not smooth enough, I'm going to go and find another part. But I would like to have, the camera deserves to be as original as possible. So I'm only replacing what I really need to replace. That feels okay. Let me fit the rewind knob on there and shift that up and down a few times. Yeah, no, that's good. That's a nice smooth movement. It's important that that's reasonably smooth and even. What happens with that is that when you raise the rewind knob up slightly, it should raise the knob up and the internal shaft. It should not pull the shaft out of the film cassette. Otherwise you'll be in the position that one of my customers found himself in, where he went to rewind his film, but he was too enthusiastic at pulling the film, rewind knob up, and he pulled it right up. So effectively he'd pulled the shaft right out of the cartridge, at which case of course it was no longer coupled with the cartridge and wouldn't wind film. And he was most concerned that something was broken. But really his problem was is that he was too enthusiastic. He'd pulled the knob up far too far. When you rewind the film, just raise that rewind knob up until you feel it come against it, stop. Don't keep going. You only need to pull the rewind shaft up all the way to install a new cartridge of film. Right, well that's that little piece done. I want to put an elastic band around here to help keep this in place so it doesn't fall out while I'm working on the camera, and hence I've put the rewind in first. Okay, well at that stage that's pretty much done for that part. Next I need to reassemble my film advance components and move on from there. I'll also take the time while I'm away to have a look at that cocking rack. It's interesting, that damage. I certainly wasn't expecting to find that. But there you go. Well, it's time to get on to assembling the film advance components for this camera. The focus helical and related parts are all installed and working well. Front opens and closes nicely, so that's good. I'll fit the front door later in the piece. There's a return spring has to be fitted onto the film advance. Fits right here. It's much easier to put that in relatively late in the piece, because should this shutter release shaft fall out for any reason, that spring will boing off, and typically it falls down back into the guts down in here, gets caught on the internals of this folding mechanism, and requires the camera to be completely disassembled in order to retrieve it, and I'd rather not do that. So we'll start with this, the lock lever. That locks the film advance when you reach the end of the film, when it reaches number 1. So I'm putting some molybdenum lubricant, rubbing a little bit into those holes in the casting. Drop that into place. Just check that that runs freely. No catches, that's good. and that is held in place with a circlip at the top, or an E clip or a C clip depending on who you're speaking to. And the return spring I have just pulled out of my container is a fairly light spring. There are two similar looking springs there, one that does the release lever, one that does the lock lever. This is the lock lever. Its spring is slightly shorter and it is slightly finer. That just pops that lever back into place quite neatly. That's all that's required. Next, we want to deal with our release lever. The release lever's job is to release the film advance so that you can wind on to the next shot after the shutter has been fired and not before. So again, I'm just applying a little bit of molybdenum on the surfaces that are important. Here is the release lever, and the release lever has a spring on the base, and that spring keeps the lever in firm contact with the cam on the bottom of the film advance shaft. If this spring breaks, the film advance won't work properly. It's slightly distorted, that spring, and I'm just trying to get that back to a satisfactory shape. That looks fine. And now I've got to hook that spring into place on the release lever. Of course, it doesn't want to go, but that's normal for springs. Springs can pretty much be counted upon to not to want to go anywhere you want them to go. They're just always doing their best to get over to the other side of the room, into some dark corner where you'll never see them again. That's fine, that's positioned correctly on the end of that arm. Let's pop that down on there and zoom in. You can see that spring. To line that shaft up with a hole in the top of the housing. Make sure it's all sitting neatly in place. And now that's retained with a return spring. Which has its own long screw. The screw is adjustable so that you can adjust the relative positions of the point in the travel of the shutter release, where the shutter is released and where the film advance is released, so that you can wind on to the next shot. In an ideal world, those two functions happen at the same point. We don't live in an ideal world. You do the best you can. So I'm looking at the film advance shaft here, and I'm looking for a couple of things. I'm looking for wear on the shaft. I'm looking to see whether the spring has bitten into the shaft here from being wound up too tight. There is a groove there, it's certainly bitten into the brass. I'll be looking to check to make sure that the cam here on the bottom of the shaft is riveted on firmly, that there's no rock or looseness there. That all looks good. So, lubricant. Commonly I use a graphite grease to grease this component because I like this particular grease. It's sticky, it stays where it's put. Once it's on a surface, it's hard to get it off. It means that the lubricant stays where you've left it to a large extent. So I'm rubbing it on that shaft. I'll pull back that collar and rub it on the shaft there. Now that should work on that shaft nicely, and that's well lubricated. I'll put some on the spring, so as the spring winds up as you crank tension onto it, that it's not stiff or sticky. That's good. I'm checking to make sure that the tab on the spring is in the slot on that bracket. I'm checking that the holes in this bracket line up with the holes on the cam. And I'm applying some of my synthetic lubricant to the faces on this cam that the lock lever, the release lever, runs on. There are two ratchets here, one in one direction on one face and in the opposite direction on the other face. That's so film advance can only be made by swinging the film advance lever through a complete arc. You can't inch the film advance. Likewise, when you're returning the film advance lever back to the park position, you can't swing it back, let it swing halfway back to the camera and then swing it forward again. It will only swing back to the camera. So here we've got our film take-up spool and its bush, which has all been cleaned. I'll drop that into the cavity in the body and feed in the film advance shaft. I'll get this rotated into the correct orientation so that it'll drop in nicely. The lock lever is locked in position there, holding it in place. There's our release lever sitting in its position there. Just looking for the screws that retain this. Nickel plated. We've got a number of screws here that look identical. 3 of them won't have any glue on them because they've come from this component. But they're quite likely to be greasy, so I need to find the right ones. Normally I put these 3 screws through the cleaner at the same time I'm doing the other components, because it gets all the grease off them. Also helps me identify the 3 I want. Well, I've certainly got 2 of them identified. I'll find a third. You'll do. Yeah, something's not lined up there. It just needs to go around a little bit. That's better. And it's two mates. Right, that's good. Check that the spool is sitting down flush. That looks good. Next we need to assemble the clutch. Again, I'll use the graphite grease for this particular part of the job because it's very tenacious. It sticks to those surfaces in a very satisfactory manner, and there will be a pair of pliers here that I need. Sorry for the background noise. I've got two computers running in this room. One that I'm busy repairing for someone, having to reinstall the operating system, other exciting tasks. Right, clutch is assembled and in place in the top of the camera. Let's pull that front out so the camera doesn't fall over easily. Here we have the bush. That aligns the position of the shaft at the top there. These components all change to some degree through the production of the Retina III, the C-type models. Components all work on the same principle, do the same job, but they just varied the way they went about doing that job. Through the production cycle, which is not surprising. People come onto the production team and come up with clever ideas on how they can do the job quicker and cheaper, and even occasionally better. Just checking the action of this little piece. This is the ratchet for the film advance mechanism. It ensures that the film advance mechanism at this point can only turn in one direction. When you rewind the film, you are relying on the fact that that clutch mechanism below will allow for slippage, and allow, if it wasn't there, you wouldn't be rewinding the film. Or if it was too stiff in its action, you wouldn't be rewinding the film. I just put a tiny smear of grease on that spring. It's steel. I put the smear of grease on there simply as a corrosion preventative measure. Didn't really require it as a lubricant. Right, let's get the screw in place. That's it. I thought that was it. No, it doesn't want to start. If I just push down on it, of course, I'll displace everything and have to start again. That's it. Of course, the film advance is being stopped from rotating by the lock lever, which is up in position locking it, so I can just tighten this with my screwdriver without any great hardship. That's good. The rewind button catch needs to go on. So I'm applying a little bit of molybdenum lubricant to the tip of it and some at the pivot for good measure. On the underside of the camera, this gets slid into place. Now I want to be reasonably careful at this point to keep the camera suspended in space while I'm working on it. Otherwise, if I drop it down onto the release lever and the lock lever, they'll pop up out of place and annoy me. I've also got to keep in mind that the shutter release shaft is only being kept in place with that spring, that rubber band, and I don't want it coming adrift, because otherwise, if that shaft falls out, I could find that that component on the shutter release could fall loose into the back of the camera or in behind the bellows, and I would be dismantling the whole front of the camera in order to sort it out. I don't want to do that. Alright, that looks good. Tighten that screw up. On the right set of tweezers, which for this job are fairly stiff ones, and I want to get this spring back over that lever. And I see that the video camera's battery is grizzling, that it hasn't got much life left, so I won't muck about, we'll just keep zipping along. Continuity sort of goes bad, you'll know why. The sprocket goes in with the slot to the top. The shaft for the sprocket wheel, put some grease on that shaft, towards the top, towards the bottom, a little bit on that gear at the top, certainly doesn't hurt. That should drop into place.